Hello, Principal Matters podcast listeners. Here we are again, Will Parker and myself, Jen Schwanke, to do a little bit of Q&A right before we dig into a bigger question with our podcast today. So, Will, this is a fan favorite. People love these little 5-minute snippets of you and I just kind of answering a listener question. And this question,
Mhm.
Will, it's a good one. The listener asks, "What's the best way to find a balanced leadership team when interviewing?" And the question goes on to explain, "It's hard to go deep and really see who people are in a formal interview." And I could not agree more. This is such a good question.
Good
So, when you
question.
first read it, what did you think?
Oh, it just brought me back in time. I can remember the very place I was standing. This is going to be too much information, but here it is. I was on a trip to Washington D.C. with the National Association of Secondary School Principals, and I had an afternoon where I had some time to go see the Library of Congress, and I was so excited. I'm standing in the middle of the Library of Congress when my longtime AP partner calls me to tell me he's resigned. And the sinking feeling went into my stomach because I was like, there goes my vacation. Because I was set up for the next couple of weeks to be off. And I knew finding that leadership team member is so important. And so I remember reading through 30 different applications and just agonizing and trying to reach out to people to bring them in. And so, Jen, this is so hard. You're right. The formal interview process doesn't always tell you what you want to know when it comes to finding that right team member. So I'll start there to just acknowledge that this is not easy.
Right, right. I teach a graduate class at The Ohio State University for aspiring principals, and I had hiring as maybe a 20-minute conversation we were going to have, and it stretched into 2 class periods because people, aspiring principals, veteran principals, this is the crux of it, isn't it? You want a team in flow. You want everyone to get along, but push one another in a way that conflict is managed well, and one person, we all know this, even from teaching, one student can make the balance of a class off, and that student misses a day, and you're like, "Oh, oh, wow." And that's the same with a professional team, and I liken it a little bit to dating. You can, go on a date with somebody, and they're lovely, they're wonderful, but do you wanna marry them quite yet?
Mhm.
Not really. And so you have to kind of think beyond, "I like this person, she was so much fun, and she's so bubbly, and she'd be great," to who is this person really? And I don't mean to use "she," implying that all teachers or leaders are women, you know what I'm saying, though. You
Yeah.
have to really think about what your team needs and look beyond that 30 or 45-minute interview.
Mhm.
See beyond that. So, Will, I know you probably have thoughts on that.
No, and I agree. And that's why I spent so much time not just looking at the person sitting in front of me, but looking at their past work and examining their experiences and looking at their reflections of what they've published or what they've shared online, so just get a sense of the totality of how they're perceived in the community. And then I'll say this because this is a 5-minute Q&A. For me, the most important quality of any leader, because everyone's going to have a different voice, a different personality, a different gift and strength they're bringing to a team. But the most important thing to me is trust. Is this a person who's trustworthy and a person of integrity? Because we can work through all kinds of differences if we can trust each other. And
Right.
so that's the most important quality to me.
And by the way, the second part of this question made me chuckle a little because when they said it's hard to see who people are in a formal interview, I was going to quip, "This is why I only hire people who have subbed in my building." I used to do that as a principal because I knew
Yeah.
them. I'd seen them and I saw how they worked with others. Now, that is so not a realistic setup for many people. I recognize that. But boy, if you can see someone work, if you can see how they handle a bad day, a bad interaction, a bad drive to work, any
Mhm.
number of things that can throw people off. If you can see it first, that, my friends, is ideal.
Well, I'll look in the show notes to see if I can find. I've got a couple of posts on hiring tips for you when you're looking for a good position. But I'll dig back. I'm writing in a note to myself now because my good friend Jimmy Casas um, has some really great content on hiring for excellence, and some of the tips that he's given in that work is stuff I've leaned into in the past too. That just gives you a much longer version of what Jen and I are talking about here when it comes to making sure that you're doing your due diligence and not just exactly what this question's asking, not just using the formal interview as the only way to understand the person that you're bringing in. So I'll see if I can find that and put a link in the show notes. But Jen, thank you
Thanks,
for the
everyone.
5 minutes. And
Yeah.
thank you, Principal Matters listeners. You can find all of the content for this podcast at williamdparker.com. You can reach out to me through my email at will@williamdparker.com. Or Jen, how can they find you?
They can find me at jenschwanke.com.
Thanks, Jen.
Thank you.
Principal Matters Podcast, episode 416. Hi, friends. This is Will Parker, host of Principal Matters, the School Leaders Podcast, where each week we bring you inspiring, innovative, and imaginative ideas for your own school leadership. This week I'm joined by my co-host, Jen Schwanke. Dr. Jen Schwanke, it's so good to see you. And I just have to say a couple of things before we jump into today, because this episode will come out in October, and sometimes I just forget to celebrate, and I want to celebrate some things that you got to do this summer. This past summer, you got to be in Canada. You spoke at Ignite. You will be, by the time this comes out, will have spoken in New Jersey. I will have been in California and in Oklahoma and Columbus. And coming up this fall, since this is an October recording, you're going to be speaking at ASCD October 20th. Congratulations. And also, you and I are going to be beginning this month a virtual series with our friends at SANES, the Secondary Association for
New York State.
New York State. And so if anyone's listening from New York State and you're a member of that Principals Association, pay attention, because Jen and I would love to see you in the series that we're going to be doing once a month to just talk about next level leadership. So Jen, kudos to the great work you've been doing, and welcome back to this conversation. Anything you want to say before we get going? Because I have a story to tell you.
No, I want to hear your story. You told me that right before we started recording, and now I'm like, come on, get to the story. I don't want to hear about where I've been. I want to hear about where you're going with the story.
All right, let me set the stage. I wanted to, when I travel, I sometimes I write some things down, and I don't always have an opportunity to share them. And so today we were getting ready to record. I told Jen I want to talk about today's topic, which is every student has a name, but I want to tell two stories before we jump into a conversation about students. So a few months ago, I was flying to a conference, and I was connecting in Chicago, and it was early in the morning, and it was so early, Jen, that it was still sunrise. So um, I wrote this memory down because it was so vivid in my mind, because it was one of those beautiful mornings with a rose-colored sky and, awakening above the dark expanse of Lake Michigan, which we were flying over because our plane was banking and coming back in. And the panorama of the city below was just breathtaking. I'm a country boy, so when I travel, I still am just overwhelmed with the thousands of twinkling yellows and reds of headlights and taillights and city lights. And every highway by this time, because it was about 7 a.m, was lined, and you could tell there was traffic flowing in some directions and stalled in other directions. But from every vantage point that I could see, there were lights. And I just had a thought as I was looking at those lights, Jen, that every one of those marks a spot where where some piece of humanity was existing, whether that was a light that someone had installed, or a light where someone was sleeping, or a light where someone was working, or a light marking someone who was traveling. So that's story number one. So here's story number two. I was watching a documentary also while flying, called My Name is Salt by Farida Pacha. And this is a documentary that's been around since 2013, but I came across it because I love documentaries. And so let me just set the context. And sorry, Principal Matters listeners, if my stories are long-winded, but in this is a documentary with no words. There's no script, but it is the story of one family in the desert of Little Ron of Kutch, which is a 5,000 square kilometer area of saline desert in the Gujarat state in India. So this is like as remote as you can be. And every year, 40,000 villagers return to this area that where all the fields are flooded, um, had been flooded with mud, but then they recede and it's just covered in salt. And so the the people there, they have this painstaking work of digging trenches by hand, using diesel powered water pumps to flood the fields that they want to dig into with saline water. And then after the saline water is able to settle for weeks and weeks and weeks, then they gather all this salt that they sell. So here's the piece that I wanted to pull from this story. Most of them live in huts and on dirt floors, and there's one school available in this entire area that's funded by an NGO. And so here in this sea of humanity are these groups of people who every year return for generations to just harvest and sell salt. And as I was watching that, I was thinking, you know what? Every one of those kids has a name. And every one of those people I was flying over um, in that earlier setting in Chicago has a name. And so I wanted to start there today because I wanted to have this conversation. Every school that you and I get the opportunity to work in, um, every person listening to the show represents a community full of students, all who have their own unique point of humanity. And yet, when we try to evaluate how is a school doing, how is a school performing, what are the outcomes of this school, we what do we tend to rely on? Um, and I'll answer my own question. We rely on data. We rely on numbers. We look at attendance records. We look at disciplinary logs. We look at achievements. And somehow in all of that, we forget that each of those data points represents the face of a child. So I just wanted to go there in today's conversation because um, sometimes I just have to give myself perspective and remember that in the sea of humanity that all of us is serving, really what matters is that individual face of each of those kids. So let me stop there for a moment, Jen, because I've got some additional thoughts, but I wanted to just begin there because I know you have thoughts too.
Well, and I think it's so important that you're bringing up this conversation because I think as a nation, we lost our way a little bit with the humanity piece. Not everyone, and I think not individually we did. I think as a collective group we did. When A Nation at Risk came out and the accountability era took off, we started looking at students as numbers and we started looking at teachers as numbers as well. And we boiled their performance, their training, their perspective, their skill, and their knowledge down to what value they add to a child. And that made me sick then, and it makes me sick now because the way we measure the value a teacher brings should never be on a test score or a moment in time, because value can be, that teacher was the kindest person I ever met, or that teacher was a role model that I needed. That value will never come out on a standardized test. And so we really lost our way when we went down the path of accountability. And that's not to say we don't need it, but as you said, we forget the face. We forget that every backpack, every belly button, every student that comes in has a story and a need and a dream and
Mhm.
something that they're bringing to that classroom. And so I think this is an important conversation to have. And I'll turn it over to you in just one moment. But one of the things that we know is many administrators got so caught up in this data and accountability conversation that they made very poor choices and they manipulated data. And ethics policies were born to make sure that people signed and said, I will cover the things on my walls before the test, and I will make sure that I don't use anything that isn't sanctioned as a practice test. Like we lost our way. And again, I'm not saying that accountability isn't important. I'm saying it really erased the personalized approach that we took in education for so long.
Thank you for that, Jen. And I want to be clear what I'm not saying and what we're not saying. We're not saying accountability is not important. We're not saying that we shouldn't measure growth. But what we're trying to And I know we're preaching to the choir by the listeners to this podcast too, but sometimes I just think it needs to be said again that every student has a unique background that he or she brings to school every day, and we don't always know their stories. But when we get to know them, we can uncover their gifts and their talents and their perspectives. And then we're often surprised by what they actually do bring to us. But then when we start measuring performance, whether it's attendance or discipline or achievement, we and you and I both are a part of a lot of learning community conversations. So we know that the essential questions people ask are what are they learning? How do we know they're learning it? What do we do about it? Um, but we need more than just numbers to tell us the answers to those questions. So I'm not suggesting that we stop analyzing data, that we stop tracking standards, any of that. But what I'm trying to remind myself of in the work of looking at achievement is it's not just quantitative, it's qualitative too. And so for leader, go ahead, Jen.
I also want to sit a moment in what happens when we don't see the deeper story to teachers.
Mhm,
It turned too much intense accountability practices and data management turns parents against teachers
mhm,
if they don't see their child progressing at the rate that the parent or a normed graph indicates their child should be growing. So I think it's a balance. I think we need a bunch of things, but what we're doing is we're assuming that at any given time a child is at their best academically, cognitively, socially, emotionally, and all that, and they're not. They're still under construction, right? And so
mhm.
when we feel like data shows a child isn't moving, I would say, well, not yet in that area. I think it can be a little bit of a misstep when people say, "Well, I don't care about data. That's not what I care about." I think we should say we care about data and we care about so many other things too. And kids they're a work in progress. I mean, I'm 50 years old and still working on myself. And heaven help me if my journey had been marked by a standardized trajectory. So we just have to keep all of that in mind that it's a journey, man. It's long.
Let's take a moment to thank our sponsors, and then we'll be right back. Why is IXL used in 95 of the top 100 US school districts? Because it works. IXL is research proven to benefit all student populations, including English language learners and special education classrooms. IXL is an all inclusive online learning and teaching solution for K 12 that accelerates achievement, saves teachers time, and more. This one platform helps you accomplish what normally would require dozens of other tools. For example, as students practice skills, IXL automatically differentiates learning to help them master concepts at their own pace. Teachers get real time insights into how students are performing so they can provide timely support. What I personally love about IXL are the personalized SAT and ACT study plans. Students just need to enter their most recent test score, and IXL automatically generates a custom list of skills they should work on to improve their scores. Discover what IXL can do for your school. Visit IXL.com/PM today. Well, with that in mind, I want to sit here for just a moment too, Jen, because um, a lot of the professional development that we're receiving in our schools is helping us to better identify where students need to learn and improve and how we can do that collaboratively. But within that conversation, I also don't want to lose sight of what are the ingredients for the foundational what are the what are the foundational norms necessary for healthy school cultures that are producing good outcomes for kids. And so because you and I do this kind of work, and I've worked with a lot of schools over the last 10 years, especially, I try to read a lot and study a lot about what are the common traits of healthy environments for businesses, for schools, for organizations. And so I'm just going to refer to one that I've referred to before, but this was a book I used last year in some mastermind and executive coaching, and that's Patrick Lencioni's book, The Five Dysfunctions of a Team. And so I want to sit here just as one example for listeners of just a reminder of what are the ingredients of the kinds of healthy cultures where people are still recognized for their individual contributions, and yet there's still collective results happening. So Patrick Lencioni breaks it down into 5 areas that he says are dysfunctions of unhealthy teams. And I'm going to flip them and read them in terms of their positives. So here's the negative side first. Unhealthy cultures have an absence of trust. They fear conflict. They're um, they have a lack of commitment. They avoid accountability, and they're inattentive to results. So those are the negative sides. Now let me read those back in terms of their positive traits. That means that strong teams trust one another, engage in unfiltered conflicts around ideas in a healthy way, commit to decisions and plans of actions, hold each other accountable for delivering on those plans, and they focus on the collective results and achievements of their schools. Now, because we're leaders, sometimes I know I'm a nerd when it comes to like wanting to really understand what's going on behind what's going on. Um, but I just wanted to sit here for just a moment, Jen, because I think sometimes it's important for us to revisit these foundational qualities because we know they work, and we know when we've been in schools and organizations where these are healthy attributes, because you see the speed of growth and the power of these of the outcomes there versus experiences we've had where those negatives exist. So let me give you a moment to respond to that.
Well, I think what you've tapped into there a little bit too is collective efficacy, and I talk about
Hmm.
that a lot.
Hmm.
And it's the belief that you can make a difference for the child. And I think that's a key conversation to add to it is not just the data, not just numeracy, literacy, facts, but what kind of student, what kind of thinker, kind of learner, mathematician, scientist that we are developing, and where confidence plays into that, and where identity plays into that.
Hmm.
And when I think the saddest thing for me is a child who truly believes they're not good at anything. To me, a strong culture, strong teacher morale, students who have confidence and identity, that's the kind of school culture you want to go with. I wouldn't want to be a principal who says, well, I came in and our data went up 3.6 percentage points. I want to be the principal that people say, we love your school. And I always tell groups when I present to them, the measure of a strong school is when a substitute says, I love being here.
Hmm.
Those are the kind of measures I think that matter. So that's my little speech about collective efficacy, but I'll give it back to you.
No, I love that, and I'm so glad you said that because that's the research again
Mhm,
confirms so much of what, and that's Hattie's research that confirms exactly what you and I are talking about. But I want to speak to this tension for any leaders listening right now, because I don't think you're alone if you've ever felt this tension, which is, yes, Will and Jen, I know that at the end
mhm,
of the day, it's the hearts and the outcomes and the
mhm,
individuals that I'm serving that matter the most. But I also know that I'm being held accountable for their achievement,
mhm.
and I'm going to be asked to report on their data, and I'm going to be invited to present to the board whenever those test scores come out. And so, how do I work within the tension of um, of that collective accountability that's going to be required of me to answer for, while at the same time um, maintaining my finger on the pulse of the people that I'm serving? And so I want to sit in that tension for a minute, Jen, because this is a real tension for not just for leaders, but for teachers too, because teachers feel that same tension too, which is how in the world am I supposed to meet and achieve all these standards and responsibilities while at the same time adequately taking care of kids? In other words, how do I address these complexities of my work that where these tensions exist? So it's not just tensions for leaders. I think it's tensions for everyone.
Well, here's what I would say. I think it's 2 steps. I think first, you don't as a principal, you don't try to speak for every child's test score. You can't. You don't even try to speak for every child's story because you can't, but teachers can. And so you say, if a parent has a question about test scores, or if the board says, "Well, wait, let's break it down to your 3rd grade learners or your 8th grade learners and what happened there." You say, "This is what my teachers tell me. This is what we know about these students." For a parent, you have them go directly to the teacher. Then step 2 is you tool those teachers up. Don't just throw them to the wolves, right? You get people together and you say, okay, what are some things that we can explain to parents? Some of them we already know. They're almost cliches. This is a snapshot. This is one point in time. There may have been other factors to explain a dip in a trajectory. Um, but then you use the ideas of that group, right? Because then you're doing 2 things. You're building collective efficacy and you're building a bank of how we talk about data and how we talk about growth. So you can even role play a parent that comes in and is really concerned about a data point, a parent that doesn't care about data points, a parent that has forgotten all the gifts their child does have because of one negative test score. And you role play it and you create a bank, either figuratively or literally write them down, of some sample responses you might have to help a parent understand their a test score. So I think it's for principals, don't own it all, for goodness sakes. You can't. Ask other people to share this leadership, this conversation, this philosophy, and help them know how to do it.
I agree. In Patrick Lencioni's work, there's something interesting that he does with those categories of avoiding accountability and inattention to results. And I wrote this down, so I just want to read this to you. That in his book, he attributes the avoidance of accountability to what he says is a culture of low standards. And then in his inattention to results, he connects that to um, people's focus or obsession with their own status and ego as opposed to shared outcomes. And so I remember when I was reading this, I was thinking about that in terms of, first, let me hold the mirror up to myself. When in my work has my own status and ego pushed me away from the collective shared outcomes that we're all trying to achieve together? Because that's where it starts. Before I'm addressing that with my team, I have to address that with myself. And then I had to ask myself that question, wow, how does that feed across an entire school? Because teachers sometimes will push back in terms of, like, I need more autonomy, or I need to be able to do my thing, because you keep asking me to do more and more collaboratively. And the answer to that question isn't either or, it's both. And so, Jen, I just wanted to sit here for just a couple of more minutes because there's 2 things I want to say as we kind of try to wrap this up in the next 5 or 6 minutes. Um, I just think, like in so many of the conversations you and I have, that it's okay for 2 truths to be present at the same time. And truth one is that every person is unique and important. And truth two is that the collective outcomes of our community are just as important as the ones of the individual. So, what are the implications of that? When a leader is able to hold both of those in tandem, what are the implications for their perspective as they lead?
Well, the implication to me, I don't know if this is where you're going with this, but the implication to me is nobody's alone in this.
Mhm.
We're we're all trying to do the same thing. We want an educated society. We want to work together. We all have our own individual skills and strengths. Data might not capture that. It's a long road. It's a marathon, not a sprint. And if we keep those things in mind, and if a principal can continually remind others of that, what they're essentially doing is they're taking, think of an old-fashioned scale, and they're never letting one side get too high or too low. They're reminding others, students, parents, community, board members, that the magic happens in a balance.
Mhm.
And so that to me is the most important implication, because to me at least it brings comfort. We're not going to get too high. We're not going to get too low. We're never going to panic. You want to know why? Because we believe in ourselves. We believe in our students. We believe it's going to be okay. You know what my sister says? I worry about my son quite a bit because he's the one who I told him, colleges are going to look at your grades and your test scores and be like, well, that's a kid who doesn't do any homework. Um, because that's him, right? Data test scores are phenomenal. His grades, not so much. My sister says this phrase to me all the time. She says, you know what? I'm not worried about him at all. And I find that so comforting. And I think teachers should say that to parents when they think about a student with a data point that might have dipped. I think principals should say that to teachers. I'm not worried about you at all. I know you're doing great things. Teachers, tell a parent, I'm not worried about your son. I'm not worried about your daughter. We're working hard. We have things to do, but I'm not worried. I mean, just think how good that feels to think, okay, we're all in this together.
I love that because whatever that moment is that you are with that parent, or with that teacher or with that student is, again, it's just one marker of a lifetime of experience
Yeah.
for someone, and it shouldn't define that person's entire experience. So let me sit here, um, and just think of one example for the school administrator who may be listening. And I probably have given this example before, but because so much of the work that we do is involved in student discipline, let's think about student discipline from the perspective of both of those tensions. So you have a student whose misbehavior has, or whose conduct is out of line, has placed them in a position where now they have to receive some kind of consequence. And you're wanting to do two things in the situation. One, you're wanting that student to live up to his or her best potential and be the best human that they can be in your school. But you're also wanting their behavior to be in line with everyone else's behavior in the school so that this can be a place where mutual trust and safety are a part of the school community. So somehow I have to hold you both individually accountable and protect the security of everyone else in the school. So even in student discipline, you're managing both those tensions true at the same time, which is how do I manage the student in a way that holds him or her accountable, but also how do I maintain the strength and stability and consistency of the school environment. So if we forget the individual, we become an educator who treats kids like cogs in a wheel. But if we forget the community, then we fail sometimes to give appropriate consequences, that build trust back into the community at large. So I don't know if that's helpful, Jen, but that's something I have to keep in mind.
I feel like we got really philosophical on this episode, and we've done some quick 5-minute Q&As. We've had a lot of fun in some of our episodes, and now our listeners are probably like, God, what happened to them? Are they they drank some seriousness potion? But no, I think it's a really good conversation to have, and my hope is that it doesn't come off as too idealistic. But we are being idealistic here, and we
Mhm.
are trying to provide the balance that we are asking principals to provide. I think
Well,
it's okay that we got serious, is what
no,
I'm
you're
saying.
making me laugh because, at the time of this recording, I know this is coming out in the fall, but it's still summer when you and I were talking. And yesterday I got to go out on the lake with my son, my son, Jack, and because we have some kayaks, so we were just out rowing together and having fun, and we were talking about life and all the crazy stuff going on in our culture and world and politics. And so sometimes it's so cool how your kids can bring things full circle. And so, um, Jack, who's 18, and I were just talking about all of the complexities of trying to understand what's going on in the world, and then realizing how hard it is to be a person who's willing to see things with nuance. And he was even saying that it's really hard today to find people who are willing to say, there's actually two sides to that,
Mhm.
or there's actually, you can look at it from both directions, or there's some complexity in that, because that doesn't sell books,
Mm-mm.
and it's not a quick 5-minute conversation. And but what I have discovered when especially when I'm working with leaders, and especially when I'm coaching leaders in hard decisions, is often they're not trying to make a decision between what's right and wrong. They're trying to make a decision between what's right and right.
Mhm.
And
Right.
so Principal Matters listeners, as we wrap up today, I just want to invite you to, as you think about the complexities of your work, that it's good to remember that in the sea of humanity that you're serving, that every one of those people has a name. But at the same time, that all of them are individually important. So is the whole at the
Community.
same time, because as school leaders, the decisions that we make today when we're holding people accountable it can be done by keeping both those things in mind at the same time. So
Exactly.
Jen Schwanke, thank you for letting me go deep. And
Thank you.
Principal
And
Matters listeners,
listeners, yeah, thank you for letting us get all serious. We'll be a little more giggly next time, perhaps. Thanks,
well,
everyone.
for anyone who's listening to this at the time of its release, don't forget to jump online and look up the ASCD Leadership Summit. Jen, that's coming in October 20th. And what are you going to be doing there?
Oh, you've got to come, everyone. This is ASCD's small conference. It's awesome. And I'll be talking about how to manage conflict, because guess what? We all have it.
All right. Well, Principal Matters listeners, thank you for doing what matters. We'll talk to you again next week.
Thanks, everyone.
You'll find free resources like this one at williamdparker.com. Subscribe for our free weekly newsletter, which contains bonus material, and also check out the links for Grow Academy's Masterminds, Executive Coaching, and Keynote presentations from my books, as well as from Principal Matters Associates. You can find out more under our speakers tab at williamdparker.com. Thank you for learning together, and thank you for doing what matters.